Hello, everyone, and welcome to Infancy and Childhood. Now, for a while, I thought that I was going to skip this chapter entirely because I thought most of you aren't going to be working with children this small. This is mostly for parents. But at the same time, so much of what happens later with children, with the middle childhood age, or with the young adolescents or late adolescents, begins here. And so it's really, I think, important to lay this foundation. So this is sort of a beefy video because it's going to cover physical, cognitive, and social development of very small people, birth to age 2. But I think it's worth taking a look at. And so I'm just going to touch on some of the highlights and add some stuff about brain development for you. So basically, newborns, if you've got one, you've seen them in action, they do a few things really well. They cry, they sleep, they eat, and poop. That's the infant states. And they eat a lot, and they sometimes wake up a lot at night. And so they can be pretty exhausting, but they're also pretty fascinating because they're fascinated with themselves. Their eyes are still focusing, their skulls are still fusing, their heads are still very wobbly on their spinal columns. So they're pretty interesting little creatures. And one of the things, because their heads are still developing, if parents get frustrated and shake a baby, this can cause lifetime problems because of how the brain is developing. So one of the things you can do if you know somebody who has a young child or like a baby, an infant, is to offer to help them if they're ever stressed, because it becomes very easy to want to respond badly sometimes to the sheer frustration of the never-ending eating, sleep, and not sleeping poop cycle. By toddlerhood, toddler states have become sort of a non-regulated sort of craziness of emotion sometimes. There's this great strand of pictures on the internet where parents have shown like what has just made their toddler lose it. and so Freud would, of course, explain this in terms of the id being the me, I need what I want it now, with the superego coming online way later, to say, oh no, that's not how we behave. It's the self-reflective part of the society rules. And then the ego, which is just sort of the real us in the middle of these like best worst impulses, right? So here's our toddlers. They very often respond worst impulses, right? In order to understand the ways that infants and toddlers are developing brain works, I'm going to ask you to think about it like this, because I think it's a little bit more helpful than just looking at diagrams of the brain. So we actually have 3 brains, and we kind of develop from the inside out this brain. And so what develops first, think about it as a golf club, and that the head of that golf club is your brain stem, and the rest of the golf club is your spinal cord going down from there. That's our reptilian brain. That's our very, very oldest brain that's in charge of what neuroscientists like to joke is the 4 Fs, which are feeding, fighting, fleeing, and, well, reproduction. And so it's very instinctual. It's very primal. And then later on, we developed the limbic or emotional feeling brain. I'm using a sock puppet to illustrate this just to give you this idea. Our emotional brains look really terrifying right now, right? So this part is what we have more in common with mammals like cats and dogs, which these animals have emotions, and the limbic brain is all about emotional development and mood and memory and emotion. And that's our second brain that's wrapped around this very first, very primal reptilian brain. And then on top of this, we have our neocortex, which is the brain that you see in all the pictures, right? And the cortex and the prefrontal lobes, especially prefrontal cortex, this is, where our self-regulation comes in, our judgment, our planning, those kinds of things that are thought of to be more higher order. And so when you think about that toddler screaming, it's because the emotional brain's working pretty well. But that part that is coming online, that is self-reflective and more like, this is not how we behave in this situation, is still developing. So this is how we usually see the brain, right? In terms of it not looking like a sock puppet on a golf club. And I want to say more about that because I think that especially the emotional centers of the brain are really, really interesting as they're in flux and as they're developing. And so when you look at this version of the brain, what you're going to see are the parts that are labeled right here are called the emotional midbrain. And two of these parts are interesting because the amygdala comes fully formed at birth. And the amygdala, if you look at it here, is this little purple almond-shaped piece, and it is fully emotion. It is fear and aggression, and it fully online at birth. And interesting fun fact, this part of the brain is larger in people with PTSD, probably because of the way that it needs to function under stress. The hippocampus, on the other hand, it's the part of our emotional brain that gives that story, gives that fear, that emotional reaction context. So it gives it the story. It's not just that you saw a snake and felt the fear reaction. It's that it gives you oh, I saw it on the path when I was walking with my parent. And it's the hippocampus has language attached. It's spatial. It gives you imagery and narrative. But that part of the brain doesn't come online until age 3 or 4. So babies can feel intense emotion. They can feel stress, but they won't have the words for it. They won't be able to process it until later. In fact, I'm going to add one more thing there. You may have felt an amygdala response if you've ever jumped before you ever realized what you were jumping at. Like you realized that it was a shadow after you already jumped. And that's because our brain is developed to save our lives. And so if you wait till you process what that kind of snake is in your prefrontal cortex, it may have already bit you. So many times you'll feel that fear response kick in well before you have a story for it. So interesting part about the brain and the developing brain. Another part about the developing brain that I think is really interesting is the process of myelination. And this is where our brains get bigger. And from birth to age 2, the brain doubles in size. It's an amazing time for brain development. And you can think of myelination as like an electrical wire, which is the neuron, and being covered and coated with plastic insulation. And this insulation helps the neurons become more efficient. And it also accounts for the size, this process of myelination. That's what accounts for the doubling in the brain size at this time of life. Another thing that's happening is the proliferation of synaptic connections. So from newborn, where you have these very, very few connections, to age 2, you'll notice that they're just absolutely everything's connecting to everything else. And this process is going to continue till early adolescence, when the brain actually starts pruning away the parts that aren't used as much. This also helps the brain become more efficient. But right now, the brain is in full tilt connection mode. Another thing that's interesting is experiences for children actually build brain architecture, which I think is fantastic and interesting. So when you give little children words for things like, oh, I see that, you broke your toy. What you're feeling right now is sad. I see that you're like playing in your food, and that I see that you are happy right now. When you give children words for what they are feeling, you're actually changing brain architecture. It strengthens synapses for emotional development. And so labeling things, talking to babies and young children is really important, even if you think they're not understanding that. So what young children, very young teeny people need for optimal development is experiences, is interaction. The brain expects interaction. And And without sufficient interaction, then we actually have less development when it's needed. Now, the problem with this, with parents learning that the brain is doubling in size at this with very tiny people, is they can start pushing their children really, really early to do things like, take ballet or learn violin, because they have this feeling that if they don't catch this critical moment of development, then their child will never become a concert violinist or never become good at math, and it's all about competition. A lot of times these are middle class or upper middle class parents who really have an eye toward their child's future, and while that's good, most periods in child development are not critical. Critical means that if you don't learn violin now, you never will. Most periods are sensitive periods for children. That means, children will learn another language better at a younger age, say early child or middle childhood. Absolutely. Easier than trying to learn it as an adolescent or, heaven forbid, middle age. But critical periods are more rare, and they have more to do with attachment issues or neglect. Critical, for instance, in terms of attachment, children need a constant caregiver really early on in order to form bonds with other people, to be able to speak well. I've given you a couple of extra videos to take a look at in terms of how experiences or the lack thereof build or alter brain architecture. So you're going to pick between those videos this week. So a couple of them are brought to you by the Center of the Developing Child by Harvard. Jeez, listen to me. So they're short, they're interesting. I encourage you to watch them. The other thing that parents will often do, because they're aware that the brain is developing quickly, is they will overstimulate their child. They're like, well, I'm going to get them mirrors and black and white toys and throw everything out. Babies also don't need that. They need interaction with humans. This is a quick slide. Yes, the brain is also developing laterally into our left and right brain hemispheres. But the biggest takeaway I want you to have from this slide is not just that mostly language happens on the left brain, or mostly that creativity and art and music and holistic functions happen on the right brain, but this stuff is really distributed. It's not like the other side of the brain shuts off while you write your essay. And what else is interesting about infant brains and toddler brains is it's called plasticity. They're very malleable. It's almost like the cells don't know what they're supposed to do yet. And so the experiences at this young age really do determine how those cells and neurons develop. And one of the best things that you can do is talk to your babies, do babble. All that kind of language that sounds obnoxious if you haven't had children yet. That's like, who is a little baby? Who is my favorite little... That's actually very, very healthy. It's called serve and return, when a baby babbles at you and like, blah, 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 and you do that back. Very powerful stuff. Building brain architecture. Reading aloud as early as 6 months. Building brain architecture. Babies are already starting to internalize basically the proponents of grammar, like how words work in sentences, the rhythm of language. Adverse effects also can work on the brain, because we know, because the emotional centers are in place so early, that children are actually affected by their parents' moods as early as 3 months, and that they are affected by shouting even when they're asleep, very early on too. So, and what that does, what adverse effects do, chaos and traumatizing events, things that cause stress in a young baby or child, it creates cortisol in the brain, which is actually, it's a fight or flight kind of hormone, which is actually like, it's okay to have that now and then, but when the brain is constantly bathed in that, it's very dangerous. So take a look at the Harvard videos if you like. One's just in general, how experiences build brain architecture. And the other one is what happens with the lack of experiences or neglect. So I want to say a little bit about cognitive, emotional, and social development before I turn you loose to explore the chapter on your own and the videos. So along with the brain, notice that the brain is not just developing without context, that it is a purely physical thing. It is not. It isn't developing in tandem with emotion, in tandem with cognition. So you have these little teeny people who come to us already with temperaments. It's like they have a predisposition already. And this is not necessarily an indicator of who they will become. So you can have an easier flexible child, which is most of them, by the way, who can be a very stubborn adolescent, or you can have a screamer, a difficult or feisty child, who becomes a quite, let's just say, rational human being later. My sister's first child was a screamer. That child, she screamed like nonstop for most of her whole first year. Her parents like constantly looked like they were missing patches of hair they'd pulled out of their own heads. Because babies come to us for whatever reasons with temperaments. And so more difficult children, fearful children who don't want to go to anyone but their own parent, they can be very, very difficult babies. Now, in terms of cognition, Piaget called the behaviors he observed in infants the sensory motor stage, where the way that the child experiences the world is through all of the senses, through sucking on things and pulling on things and throwing things. And so that's why you have to hide all of the small objects from young children, because they are going to eat them, because that's how they explore the world. And very young children lack object permanence. This is the age where if you like hide a toy from them, they're like, yeah, it's gone. They drop something off the high chair. There goes the pacifier. They don't look for it because it's out of sight, out of mind. So it takes a little longer for small children to realize that, oh yeah, you're still in the world. Your toy is still in the world if they can't see it. Now, Erikson, unlike Freud, wanted to look like less on the individual, but the individual as it developed in a social context. And for Erikson, we'll remember that he postulated that the ego develops as it resolves social crises. And he thought for these very tiny people that the two social crises that the young person is trying to resolve is, first of all, whether or not they trust the world. And they learn trust, according to Erikson, the more that their needs are met, the more they realize that they can trust. And by age 2, by toddlerhood, Erikson postulated that the crisis was autonomy versus doubt. Now, autonomy is when you make your own decisions. You have autonomy when you're like, oh, you know what? I think I'm going to try this out. I am on my own right now. So Erikson postulated that by toddlerhood, what children were really trying to do was start to brave the world in their own ways, that they could crawl off and kind of seek their own adventures, maybe. Now remember that Erikson's theory, it's the downside of it is it's not a scientific study. It's hard to prove, but what he was looking at, or what he saw as big patterns of behavior. And we'll be looking at Erikson some more later, because he also had a lot to say about adolescence and how we develop socially there. Now, another interesting thing that's happening with very tiny people is something called emotional referencing. And that is that the child takes their emotional cues from the parent. Like if the parent's like, it's okay, the parent looks unruffled, the baby seems to be like, okay, I guess that's okay. It's why like sometimes you'll see a young child like like experience something that might be like mildly painful. Like, I don't know, the dog plays with them a little roughly, and they will look at the parent like, should I be terrified now? Like, should I cry? You can almost see this moment where the infant's like, how am I responding to this? One interesting, if you want to Google something interesting, look at the visual cliff experiment if you want to see emotional referencing in action. And basically, this experiment was that you can see here from the image that experimenters put plexiglass over basically what looked like a cliff to an infant, and then asked the parents to like coax the child over that cliff. Now, very young children can detect depth perception, and so this was kind of terrifying to the child. But so what they measured was the child's what they looked at was the child's willingness to cross that cliff based on the parent's face. And so if parents were like, it's okay, here's your toy, come on over, the children were more likely to trust them, back to Erikson, and cross that visual cliff. So stuff we do to tiny children in the name of science. Okay, now I'm not going to read this slide to you because there's a lot of information on it. But basically, the takeaway here is that the big thing for social and emotional development from the get-go is attachment. That little teeny people, babies, need to be able to feel attached to an adult. And this comes from warm, prompt caregiving. And it doesn't mean that every time your child cries at night, you have to give in to that. There's also a place where you have to let a child self-soothe. This parenting business is so terrifying because there's no rule book. There's no like, do I go in now or later? But attachment is the biggest thing that that the parents or caregivers or you have made this secure base where in general that child's needs are met. Now this is important and not in your book, but emotional development, when we think of the sock puppet, back to that part of the emotional midbrain on top of the golf club. As this emotional centers develop, one thing that you need to know is that shame and guilt are different emotions, and that they are felt different by children and by you. And what you want to do as you foster social development and you want children to be so pro-social, you want to, guilt is okay. if they take something from another child and they make another child cry, it's okay for you to talk to them about why that's a problem. But shame is different. And so here's the difference. You remember the amygdala and the hippocampus, that one's the little almond-shaped purple thing in our picture, and one's sort of the racetrack that goes around. Shame is an amygdala response. It is purely emotional, and it will flood your whole body. Guilt is more a storied. It distributes through the brain, and it comes online about, I don't know, people differ on this, around age 2 or 3. But basically, the difference in feeling is this. Think about it. Guilt is, oh, I made a mistake. I'm sorry. Shame is, I am a mistake. It's identifying and being shame. And if you want to know more about this, definitely look at Brene Brown's research. But shame is counterproductive. Shame correlates with depression, with suicidal ideation. Shame is internalizing that feeling of being a mistake. It and because it doesn't have a story wrapped around it, because it just floods the whole system, it's malicious. Guilt, on the other hand, is prosocial. Like if you can be like, oh yeah, you should feel guilty for doing that because you took that thing that wasn't yours and it caused somebody else pain. That's a problem. Guilt, because it's storied, is okay. It's prosocial. We learn from that. So here's the takeaway. Shame is never an effective teaching tool, either as a caregiver or a teacher. Never, never, never shame your students. Never tell them they have something wrong with them. Talk about behaviors all you want, but do not use shame, especially for young adolescents and adolescents, that it will backfire on you for good reasons. So, in sum, the basic capacity for learning is a lot of imitation and a lot of working in response to consequences in terms of reinforcers and punishers. And so small children are doing what we do. They're babbling in response to us babbling. They are able to, even though they think that if you can't see them, if they can't see you, they are doing some pretty sophisticated moves. They're able to observe and imitate. They can sort and classify. They can use symbols. They can use one object for another one in play. And they're also developing schemas for things like this is what happens in a kitchen and this is what happens with a ball. So there's a lot of learning happening. And something else that's really interesting is that even for very tiny people, they're already learning empathy, which is and pro-social behaviors, which is they respond to, like, they can see when someone else is happy or sad. This is very sophisticated stuff by age 2. And so they have this ability to self-correct, that they can see that, oh, that thing that I did made you sad. I can self-correct that. I can comfort. That's such an amazing human thing. And that is very much a human, an emotion that has come with many, many centuries of development. So here's a couple of other videos I'm going to suggest to you before I turn you loose. Do take a look at Alison Gopnik's video. Basically, her premise is that we keep thinking that we're teaching babies and young children all of the time, but she flips that script and says, basically, no. The child is the scientist, and they're experimenting on you to see how the world works. They're dropping that thing off of their high chair to see how many times you'll pick it up, to see how you will behave. So she is very interesting. So I urge you to take a look at her What Babies Think, because she's our cognition person. And then I'd like you to take, if you have time, take a look at Paul Bloom's. He's more moral development. While Alison Gopnik's going to talk about cognition, like what do babies know? He's going to talk about like how early do babies sense right and wrong and behave accordingly. His stuff is fascinating in terms of whether or not young children are programmed by nature to be self-serving, to respond to children who are like them, to experience bias, or are their dispositions more pro-social? So definitely take a peek at those if you're interested in little people, because those two child development specialists are kind of moving and shaking in the world out there. Okay, last thing. As a child development expert, you should really know where services are and what those laws are. So here's just one last slide to tell you that the Individuals with Disabilities Act required every single state in our union to have early interventions for babies and small children with deficits. So no parent should ever be alone if they're noticing that their baby is not responding to sounds, if they don't seem to be developing normally, if they're not babbling in response to a normal sort of interaction, that you absolutely need to look up what interventions are available in your state. Every state is required to have a definition of what a developmental delay is, to provide services in home sometimes, to provide evaluations, and have policies for ensuring services. So absolutely, look up the Infant and Toddler Coordinators Association, or be able to tell people about that if they are worried at all about the development of their tiny person. And with that, my friends, I'm going to turn you loose to enjoy the materials this week. I know this has been a little bit of a long video, but there's so much happening in these first years that I wanted to touch on a lot of things. And as usual, I'm looking forward to your responses and your ideas this week.